Obviously, you've seen the public commentary. There are a lot of people opposed to this, think this makes the internet less open, less free. What is to stop broadband providers from AT&T and Comcast from favoring their own content?
Thanks, and you're right. Americans are passionate about the free and open internet, and there's a lot of concern about what the repeal of the Obama-era rules means for consumers. To your point, they want to know, can Comcast start blocking me? Can they start throttling? Do they have new freedoms to charge me more? And the answer to all of that is no. Is that starting today, by repealing this 2015 Title II approach, Comcast continues to be subject to rules that are going to stop them from engaging in that conduct.
So, talk to us a little bit about how you really expect smaller providers to compete here. I mean, the argument is that they will be more competitive, more innovative, but it seems like it could have the opposite effect.
Yeah, here in D.C. on the coast, we talk a lot about AT&T and Comcast and Verizon. And I've been lucky to spend a lot of time outside of D.C., and there are thousands of literally mom-and-pop broadband providers. What they don't have is the army of regulatory lawyers that AT&T and Verizon and Comcast do. For them in particular, the cost of having to work through this Title II regime that we applied for the first time in 2015 was driving up their costs. So what we're trying to do is lower the regulatory costs of getting into this business, of competing with those big providers. And what we were seeing is that Title II was a big piece of added costs that was making it harder for those smaller providers to compete with the Comcasts of the world.
What happens if the courts overturn this?
So this is on appeal right now, and I'm pretty confident where we stand as a legal matter. The Supreme Court has already looked at this question: is internet regulation a Title II or a Title I service? And they agreed with the FCC the last time around that this is a Title I, can be classified as a Title I information service. So that's the path forward in terms of the litigation.
House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi tweeted, "Today marks the repeal of net neutrality protections. As the Trump FCC's rule change takes effect, you deserve better than this. The House must act to save these protections. Hashtag save the internet." Congress, as I mentioned, is considering a measure to nullify this vote. Should that pass, what should Congress do?
So the vote that's currently taking place in Congress that went through the Senate a week or two ago is about restoring that 1930s era Title II regulatory regime that we talked about. That's very different than a standalone bill that would enshrine some pretty common rules of the road. Look, there's really not a lot of disagreement out there about what should the basic rules be. No blocking, no discrimination, no throttling based on content. And there's legislative paths forward that would enshrine those common sense rules into law. The bill that passed the Senate, unfortunately, is focused on putting back that Title II regulatory regime. I don't think that's the right approach, but I'm more than open to legislation on a standalone basis that would put those basic rules of the road and put this entire issue to the side going forward.
Now, with respect to AT&T and Time Warner, on a slightly different subject, versus the DOJ, where do you stand on the issue of distribution?
So this is not a transaction that came before the commission, so I'll eagerly await the ruling of the judge, which I believe is expected tomorrow, just like a lot of other Americans.
And what about these Cambridge Analytica and ensuing data scandals with respect to Facebook? There is, some potential that they violated an FTC consent decree. Is this something that you're following?
Yes, and so I think what all of that underscores is how passionately Americans care about online privacy and data security. I think that's one reason as well that it's a good thing that today is the effective date for moving from Title II back to Title I. Because what that does is it gives authority back to the Federal Trade Commission, which is our nation's premier consumer protection agency, and now they can look across the internet ecosystem. So if it's your internet provider that has your data, or if it's Facebook or Cambridge Analytica, now we have an agency, the FTC, that can look at that whole operation and decide what's in the best interest of consumers. Under Title II, the Federal Trade Commission was divested of authority, data protection and otherwise, for consumers with respect to their internet providers.
Now, Chairman Pai made you the point person on the FCC's 5G wireless infrastructure initiative. There's a lot of concern from local jurisdictions about their authority being gutted. What are next steps on 5G? Yeah,
so we did an order in March that cuts about 30% of the total cost deploying what are called these new small cells. That's going to be about 80% of the 5G deployment. And to your point, I was just up in Boston on Friday at the annual U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting, and I met with a large group of mayors from around the country. And there's actually a lot of common ground here, too. They have important, long-standing role to play with respect to zoning and approvals of these new deployments. And I'm looking to find ways that we can work together. If there's outlier conduct, fees that are, making it difficult to deploy, particularly diverting capital from places that need deployments, we're looking at that and some other common sense guardrails. But the state and local officials are always going to be our partners. They're always going to have a role to play as we look at these 5G deployments.
The U.S. was the first in the adoption of 4G, but there's a concern the U.S. will be behind when it comes to 5G, when it comes to China, when it comes to South Korea. What are your thoughts on a single nationwide 5G network?
Yeah, so there is a global race that's underway to be first in 5G. And why does that matter? On the one hand, it's going to take $275 billion in private sector investment to get 5G across the finish line here in the U.S. The country that moves quickly, that's where that capital is going to flow. So we want to be first so we get the investment necessary to see 5G and so that our consumers here can benefit first. Our path forward, I think, is the same one we used for 4G, which is to incentivize private sector investment and to incentivize competition among multiple private sector companies in terms of the deployment and the provision of service. That's our game plan that worked to lead the world in 4G. And my view is that's the path forward for 5G as well.